Okay, you already met your mother.
Oh, we met, yeah, we even smoked together. We're already old friends. We're gonna write a paper this afternoon.
But this guy is very dangerous, huh?
Very good.
You too.
I want you to sign this page.
Me too.
All right, but
I'm the first one who purchased your storage. Because I don't.
yeah, you're the first one.
Here,
Oh, yeah.
in the foyer.
Because I downloaded the other one. Huh?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
You are
Yeah, it's
addressing
free.
collecting monopoly. It's okay.
We are all.
In the left side of David Divine.
Divine, yeah.
Yeah.
All is there.
Yeah, we always put it there. There was
Yeah.
part of the agreement with.
Thank you very much. Actually,
Çaldırın bir tane.
Should I go up or wait?
yeah, for all. I just took 2 minutes. Actually, they already talked about you.
Yeah.
So I gathered this information from you.
Oh, that's too long.
No, but you're still
No.
not anymore.
I resigned from that. No time. I was.
Yes, you were.
I was.
But
No,
so I did not mention.
I was
Okay. Okay then.
in the past.
You was. Okay then. I can say look all those. It's not that long.
No.
It's going to take you 2 minutes.
Many students, colleagues.
Ozan is a student of mine. Oh yeah.
It's a student of yours.
I used to be in Middle East Technical University.
Interesting. Academic families.
Yeah. You all know each other.
Yeah, it's a little chicken house worldwide. Maybe there are a total of 3,000 who are still know each other. They are not.
Okay, dear guests, it's a great honor for me to introduce you our distinguished keynote speaker, Michele Boldrin. Michele, please.
Well, I'm not Michele, obviously. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, namely Ozan Erbilur and Şiir Yılmaz, and all the volunteers who put up all this work. Now, our keynote speaker, Michele Boldrin. Let me introduce to you. It's already been done, but he's basically an expert in dynamic general equilibrium models. He worked extensively in the area of optimal growth, application of chaotic models to economic dynamics, search theory, growth and development, asset pricing and the business cycles, the theory of innovation, public economics, and the intergenerational welfare state, the determinants of credit risk, the study of democratic behavior, the theory of industrial organization, and of intellectual property rights. He did his undergrad studies at the University of Venice. He then received his MS and PhD in economics from the University of Rochester in New York. He worked at the University of Chicago, UCLA, and University of Minnesota. He's also a research fellow at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. Yeah. Now he is currently the Joseph Gibson Boyd Distinguished Professor in Arts and Sciences at Washington University in St. Louis. He was editor of Econometrica and Review of Economic Dynamics, among other academic journals. His book, Against Intellectual Monopoly, co-authored with David K. Yoine, argues that competitive markets for favor and promote continuous growth and innovation, whereas monopoly power is not necessary and probably harmful to technological change and economic development. This book is also available in Turkish and it's sold outside. So the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation and the organizer and the kind welcome. I hope not to bore you too much. If there are questions, at the end I'll be happy to take the question. What I'm going to do is to take a little bit of a long-run perspective at the beginning and then zoom in on more current issues. Let me start with the way economists start, at least of the theoretical variety, by saying some very obvious things that we often forget. One is that we all would like to have a situation in which everybody, every human being could achieve the same level of personal economic development. Because when you think of the two issues of poverty and income inequality, you realize that looking at them from an individual level, they're actually the same thing. They're the same problem. That is, for a reason or another, economic development has not been achieved by everybody and not by achieved equally. And we live in a century, like the previous one, in which, for some reason, we take economic development and growth as granted, something that should happen, and we all think it will happen sooner or later. If you think of it in a long-run perspective, this is not as obvious as we may think it is. And therefore, to the extent it is not that obvious, we may want to think of when our current understanding of economic development started. Here we can go in the long-run perspective with great confidence interval, but I would say from my own understanding, it's probably 7-8 centuries since when we've started to see on the globe phenomena of economic development that have been lasting, that is, in a reason or another, never moved backwards. One of the books that I like best in economic history is a book by, I think, a very distinguished economic historian, Jones, I think New Zealandese of origin, who worked in Northwestern for a while. Among his many books, there's an interesting one called The European Miracle, but there's one that I like in particular that is not as well known as it should. It's titled Growth Recurring. And it studies periods of growth as we define it, that is, as growth in income and consumption per capita. Malthusian growth was mostly growth not in income per capita, but in total population. Jones correctly focuses on growth in income per capita, and points out that before what we consider the modern era, there were various examples of growth taking place in some areas. He looks at a number of ones, but mostly in East Asia, but he equally mentioned things that happen in this country, the Mediterranean, Roman areas, and so on, of long periods of growth in income per capita that nevertheless never remained, never stayed. It recurred, and from this he takes, he draws a number of conclusions that I find very convincing, and I'm not going to summarize the book for you, I invite you to read it, but I'm using what follows. My way of looking at it is that after a certain period, which is roughly the origin of the communes in late Middle Age in northern Italy and in other cities in northern Europe, around the Baltic Sea mostly, a combination, most of the technological advances that eventually led to what we call the Industrial Revolution brought about a form of lasting, not only recurring, but lasting and spreading economic growth. And this had a lot to do with the fact that we became able, we humans, for a variety of technological, also political, but mostly technological reason, to embody our advances in things that would last in humans. Embodiment of technological progress is what I think economic development can last. On the other hand, it also should give us as economists, aware of the presence of scarcity as an eternal limit to our ambition, a way of understanding why it cannot spread as fast as we would like, and be very cautious when we look at miracles or advocate miracles. I will then reflect a bit on this, and I will reflect on why then innovation and spreading are maximized under free trade and competition. And at the very end, I will try my hand at a very risky proposition I mentioned before to our moderator on why inequality may be unavoidable and might even be increasing in the medium run within countries. Now let's look at the spreading versus recurring a bit more deeply. Again, the point of Jones is that if you look at the Neolithic transition, which was the very first example of growth, growth has been recurring in dozens of places around the globe. The Neolithic transition was a dramatic change of technological change. We moved from being hunter-gatherers to cultivate, settling villages, using new technologies and making them lasting over time by acquiring knowledge about agricultural techniques and building dwellings and houses and other things, fortification, irrigation systems, depending on the areas, that could last over and over and could allow for accumulation, something that was not before possible. That made a gigantic change, if you think of it. The interesting thing is that it never spread outside the political units under which it was recurring. It never spread outside the Crete, to talk about the Mediterranean, then it collapsed. Again, in the Mediterranean era, probably the earliest and long-lasting example was the Roman Empire. There was certainly a long period of a few centuries of strong growth in income per capita in various areas, but then collapsed dramatically once the political system that somehow made it possible also collapsed under military pressure. And in fact, there was even going back many dimensions. There was reflecting change, negative changes in standard of living. The technology was not such that it could become cumulative on a worldwide basis. And so when the political units collapsed, the growth collapsed and evaporated. This has changed, and I'm not going to get into the details of it. In the afternoon, we will hear about political institutions, so I will not dwell on it. But it's quite clear that if you look at the process of growth that started, say, in the 11th, 12th century, it has not stopped. It moved slowly for the first 300-400 years and started to move very fast after the 15th century. And interestingly, it moved fast in a way that managed to handle the disruption of the political units, the collapse of the communes and the free cities of Italy and the Northern Sea, to others. So ideally, you go from Italy to the northern country, to the Netherlands, then to England, and so on and so forth. And then from there, from the 16th, 17th century onward, it's quite visible and there was no coming back. As I said, there are various reasons for this. And among them, again, John's definitely my preferred economic historian. I'm giving away my preferences here in public. I've worked on this clearly. I think that the structure, the political structure, even the fragmentation and fighting, the very cost of continental Europe and surrounding areas in those years was actually very useful in preserving some of the economic growth achieved and passing the torch. But I'll focus on embodiment. On a very simple observation, that knowledge and technological capabilities starting from 13th, 14th century become more and more embodied in constructions, in buildings, and this invention of book printing here is never to be underestimated, because not only we recovered a number of things and knowledge and technical abilities. You may be aware that the steam engine was something that was known in the Mediterranean in ancient societies, but it was lost. It was never used for production until more than 2000 later. And after 1400, technological advances started to be embodied in machines that could last, in buildings that could last, in books that had the knowledge embodied in and could be studied and therefore embodied in humans. In modern days, economists are now used to talk about technological progress under the label of TFP. For those not familiar, TFP stands for Total Factor Productivity. Very interesting thing, very interesting measure of our ignorance. And here I don't want to blame Solo. In fact, of all people, Solo may be the one most responsible for pushing TFP, but he's also the one that quite clearly pointed out that it is a perfect summary statistics of our ignorance of what's driving technological progress. It's also a very easy thing to measure, or better, to estimate, because anybody that has tried to compute TFP from the data, country, for a region, for a firm, knows that depending on the quality of your data, and how well it can measure the changing quality of the inputs, machine, kind of workers, their skills, their age, their education, and so on, TFP may grow or actually shrink. Sven Grillich's first pointed out in his thesis, I think in the late 50s, that if you look at all the TFP in agricultural production in the United States, and you start, that you get very huge at the aggregate level when you just use very aggregate and therefore no precise measure of capital and labor inputs. Once you start zooming in and looking more carefully at what that capital is, and you notice that the capital of one vintage is a lot better than the capital of the previous vintage, the workers have changed, the fertilizer have changed, the inputs are not the same, and TFP disappears, as it should, because capital goods exist. Personal knowledge exists that may be transmitted or lost. Skills exist, and they are individual skills. They can be acquired, transmitted, or get lost. Try today in the United States to see if you find something doing your dresses, your clothes, your jackets by hand, perfectly and correctly, as they still do probably here, and they certainly do in the country I was born. Those skills are gone, replaced by others. Books exist, and these days other form of transmission of knowledge exists. So those things exist. TFP does not exist. So concentrating on TFP in trying to understand technological progress and economic development is the wrong way to go, which is unfortunately the way in which, on the altar of simplicity, a lot of economic development and growth theory has decided to do in the last 50 years. In spite of the complaint of people like Solo that said, be careful. It's just a measure of what we ought to understand. And it's not an exogenous input that just happens out of the sky and comes to the aggregate economy. You have to take it at granted. It's actually the thing you ought to explain. It should be the object of the theory to make it, and the research to make it. And so I like to start from that. It has a lot of implication, even if it looks like such a simple thing. Technological progress, economic development is embodied. If it is not embodied, it does not exist. And as I said, embodiment makes possible lasting and cumulative economic development because it determines accumulation. You don't accumulate TFP. You accumulate machines. You accumulate skills and perfect them. You accumulate human capital. And because it needs to be produced, and it's not an idea out in the space that turns on like light, and everybody copies it instantaneously, it takes time, effort, and resources, and economic incentive to be accumulated. This is actually the intuition on which, in the work that was kindly quoted at the beginning with David Levine, we started rethinking economic growth a while ago. In the beginning, we were taken for crazy. It's good to see 17, 18 years later that by insisting we got somewhere. Our observation was a bit of a reaction to what at the time was very popular under the label of New Growth Theory, that took innovation and technological progress as a free public good that anybody can copy it for free. And the justification was, well, that's a good starting approximation. And I agree. Sometime it is. Some rare time it is a good starting approximation to say that such and such innovation, such and such discovery is in some sense a public good, and we can take it as given and everybody can copy it. But one has to be careful of approximation. Approximations are very good if the conclusion you draw from them are robust and last when you perturb the approximation. If as soon as you perturb the approximation, the conclusions disappear or even turn upside down, then that approximation is a dangerous one. It's going to take you down a bad path. And this is exactly what has happened to the idea that innovation or public good that can be acquired and imitated for free. Because that leads to some dramatic conclusions. One of them, on which I'll focus, and I focus, is that then it is good to give monopoly power to the innovator. Otherwise, he gets copied for free. Leave aside, if the big question, I'll be happy to get to this, it's a bit of a technical issue, that even that model, the one in which you can copy for free the innovator, leads to logical conclusion opposite to what standard contemporary growth theory is. But the point is that when you start thinking that building the new innovation has some cost that the innovator has to afford, and copying it also has some cost. Imitation has cost. They may not be as high as those of the innovator, but has cost. It's essentially making a new piece of capital, be it your own knowledge, your own skill, the machine that imitates the previous machine, the production process, the factory, the good, the merchandising, whatever you want. It has cost. Using a new technology, the technology that becomes available once the innovator brings in the new machine. The innovator brings in the new machine with an old technology. The new machine did not exist. You had to use old machine to produce the new machine. Now the new machine is there, it's changed the technology space. To use a classical general equilibrium notion. It's like another activity, the one that uses as input the new machine and make copies of the new machine. That's what we call imitation. And once you think of it, then you realize that a question that I've always found so silly in a huge literature in development economics, which is the one that I have there on the third bullet point, which is why in country X, where country X is typically a less developed country than, say, United States or Germany, they don't use the technology Z that is available. You get people asking, why is that in Mexico in 1980, they do not make cars like in Japan? After all, Toyota technology was available. Or why they don't make cars like in Detroit? After all, Ford technology is available. There's this, why they don't produce medicines in Nicaragua, Turkey, or you choose, okay, or in Egypt, with the same technology they do in Switzerland. We can go on, right? How often have we seen this thing? Where the view is that the technology is this magic blueprint that is out there, lives in some place, these days, magic Silicon Valley, California. Why don't we all do Facebook? Why don't we all do Google? Why not? Why don't we do Google in Nigeria instead of shooting each other? Silly question. Totally silly question that takes for granted the fact that the Google technology is something out there in the sky, free for everybody to grab, at essentially zero cost. Tough luck, I wish. We all would be. That's again. So I think the kind of question that economic growth theory has to ask, and development economics in particular, is does country X own, or is it able to acquire the inputs embodying Z? And then it becomes a much more meaningful economic question. Can you afford it? Is it convenient? Do you have the productive capabilities to do that or not? And that makes you think of, I think they're just two examples, but you can go by the hundreds, right? These are examples that I studied back in the old days, but there are many others. Why is it it took more than 3 decades to get their plants in Mexico from the 80s onward, late 70s, early 80s, to become, in fact, they never did, almost as productive and efficient overall as those they had in Detroit? It was the same technology, it was the same cars, everything was in the blueprints. They even got the engineers down from Detroit. Why? Well, because transport of inputs didn't come on time, the electric system didn't work properly, the repairing of machinery was not done properly, workers were not properly trained, and had to retrain, they did not understand what being punctual and precise was, and so on and so forth. Toyota and other companies had the same experience when they start building plants in the United States. They also had a problem to catch up with the productivity of their star plants. Took a lot less. Why? Well, they were working on a system and a set of inputs that had higher levels of skill embodied in them, and therefore there was less investment needed to bring them on. There was growth in technological progress at work. There was GFP realizing itself in a very material way. What this means is that technological progress cannot be imported by magic. It has to be adapted and has to grow organically. What it means is that it's imitation the key to economic development. There's a huge confusion here, but when you look at data and you think at historical experience, you understand that the true engine of worldwide economic development is paradoxically not innovation. At least in the sense we use it. I'll open a parenthesis in a second. It is the thing called imitation and adoption. That is what makes 99% of the world grow. Then whoever is on the frontier in one dimension or another has to also innovate to stay ahead and make profits. But the bulk of the people move by imitating and adapting. This actually was something that Schumpeter, if you are a reader of the old classical Schumpeter of the theory of economic development, should have very clear. Schumpeter was very clear in saying that whenever you do an act of taking an input, whatever it is, and use it for something different to what it was used before, you're innovating, economically speaking, and he insisted in making a difference between economic innovation and the invention, be it of the engineer or the scientist. Not because he had disrespect for the innovation of the engineer or the scientist, because he understood quite clearly the one thing is that in the lab or at the frontier or in Silicon Valley or wherever you want in some medical lab in Switzerland, I make a scientific innovation. And then one very different economic problem is to take that thing and turn it into a factory for people to produce that particular medicine. Where the economic thing comes around is in the second one. That's the difficult problem. And this is an aside also, but let me throw it here because I think it's relevant for your country, for many others. There's a huge debate these days about the so-called middle income trap. There is countries such as Turkey, even if what we saw from our central bank before doesn't seem to suggest that Turkey has that problem at the moment. In fact, quite the opposite, so that's good news. Let's pretend. Certainly it is a problem, for example, that my Chinese colleagues sometimes are concerned. Or people that have studied Latin America are certainly very concerned. Okay? And if you look at Southern Mediterranean country, Greece, even forgetting about the particular financial crisis, Italy, Spain, what is that you observe? You observe a bunch of countries that were very far behind the frontier in income per capita productivities. Now, depending on where they started their process of catching up, some between the two wars, some right after, caught up rapidly for a while, got about 50, 60, some 40, some 70, there's an interval there, percent of the leader productivity in income per capita. I mean, use the company that gave me the passport for first, Italy as an example. Italy caught up extremely fast, especially after the Second World War, to the US level. Got from 20% to 70%, then went flat. In fact, in the last 20 years, even lost, went down. There are counterexamples. And then, if I have time, I could elaborate more on that. But let me just give you one, for small that it is. It's Ireland. Ireland is a case of catching up and in fact, leaping forward. Ireland started the process of catching up later than other European countries, de facto, only in the 70s, when income per capita in Ireland was barely a little bit more than half in Italy, and being Italy at that time about 70% of the United States, that means Ireland was about a 30, 34. And now has an income per capita that is 140% higher than Italy, and pretty close to the United States. That didn't stop. And if you zoom in and you look at the way in which the imitation, which was Ireland growth, was both imitation and adoption. Work was because the answer to the question that I asked in the previous slide could be given in the positive. That is, economic and political conditions have been created such that it was essentially comparable to acquired sector technology. So the middle income trap, it seems to me, I just throw it for future discussion, has a lot to do with the fact that it's relatively easy when you come from behind to adopt and imitate technologies that do not require skill and human capital that are very high, that can be therefore accumulated, especially in countries such as Turkey and China and so on, of old ancient civilization in which there is in some sense a diffused already level of human capital and understanding of working, factory organization, commercial relations, so on. Once you get there, if you don't manage to have the extra input, the one that gets you on the imitation of advanced technology, you get stuck. When you look at Argentina, when you look at Mexico, when you look at Colombia, when you look at Brazil, I think you can see the point, and it has a lot to do with the education of human capital of the workforce. So once you look at that problem of embodiment from that point of view, this process of stagnation difficulties become a lot easier to understand, and you start to understand much better that yes, political institutions matter, but in fact, the ability of the country, of an economic system, to spread, sustain, and increase the knowledge that is embodied in the workforce and makes it capable of catching up continuously from here is key. Is absolutely key, because I repeat, and that's the key thing I want to, either ahead or behind. The key thing to keep in mind is that there are at most a handful of innovators, but there are millions of imitators. And economic development has a lot to do with the millions of imitators, and only very marginally to do with a few, lucky or not, innovators. And so this brings me to the competition story and the work with David. No imitation of development, or at least delayed and slow development. As I said, knowledge is not thin air, it's embodied. This means that the innovator, whenever invents something, has a first mover advantage. When has a first mover advantage and the other have to imitate, you're exactly in the situation that we teach students in the first few years when we teach them the way in which the Marshallian model of competitive industry works. You remember how that works? We have all stopped using it, but my work with David was essentially an invitation to go back and rethink at Marshall because it was worthwhile. Let me give you very briefly the way it works. You remember? Marshall said, well, there is this thing, the fancy shoes with the leather sole. And there is a demand sitting out there, potential for that. And you're the first guy coming in and says, oh, I don't want to touch the shoes, the leather on that stuff, make better soles and so on and so forth. I'll start my factory with that. And I'm the first moral advantage. I know how to do it. It's embodied in me, my collaborators, my machines, my organization. And the point that Marshall makes, which is crucial, is that the first mover, the innovator, will never build up because it's too risky, because it's crazy, because just the size of it makes it impossible, because it's not profit maximizing expected value. It's not going to build up capacity to the point of exhausting demand, where demand to be exhausted at that level requires a price equal to marginal cost. You remember the Marshallian law is going to build capacity so that the price at which you sell, which corresponds to the margin utility of those shoes, is quite a bit higher than your marginal cost and even your average cost. So it leaves room for rents. Hold on, competitive rents, they're cardiac rents in some sense. Right? And those rents are those that pay, that he accrues for a while and pays for its initial investment in those goods, in that capital, in that embodied stuff. The speed at which those rents evaporate, and that's the great power of free market and free entry, has to do with how quickly imitators come in and build up productive capacity values. And then we'll have to do a lot of things. How scarce those factors are, how good this guy is to keep ahead, how good the imitators are, how many people are there that are just a little bit technologically behind him or her so they can catch up quickly. Point is that in general, those rents get dissipated. And that's the process of economic growth. Until eventually, more or less with some shakeout, the equilibrium in the long run goes to that of an industry that has capacity sufficient to produce at a quantity that is sold at a price that just covers the cost of entry. And the extra profits are gone. Well, that's the Boldrin Levine model of innovation and growth. There's nothing special. It's just Marshall, rewritten in modern language. We have made no claim of originality. We're just ringing a bell and says, hey, watch out, wake up. You know, this is the point is that once you get to the data and you look at actual industry and innovation over the last century, you realize that in every innovative industry, competitive rents are substantial. And you realize that competitive rents have driven the process of innovation, and the effort of imitators to catch up to those rents, to grab some of them before they are gone away, is what has driven the process of economic growth and imitation. That is the engine to economic growth. Why is that important? Well, that's very important because the process I described is possible. Why? It's possible only if you do not prevent the process of imitation. In the moment in which you prevent or make it more difficult and costly the process of imitation and free entry, then the process of economic growth slows down. If the leader becomes legally and magically a monopolist, he is no longer incentive to move by it. If the leader becomes magically and by law the exclusive owner of the technology for a long time, it will make that product scarce, and that will reduce the speed of economic growth and development. And again, I repeat, because for most people, imitating the leader is the only available way to economic development. You do not grow Southern Italy or Turkey or China by making new advanced medicine that cure cancer. I may get lucky, sure, but that's not what I'm going to make, the hundreds of millions of feature. Because suddenly they all become like San Francisco. No, they suddenly don't become like San Francisco. That's a pie in the sky. And what's true for individuals is true for people within a company. So the question I want to ask here, and I throw it away, is what is the role played by barriers to imitation competition, increasing economic inequality? And I finish with my risky thing. So this is risky. And if it is wrong, don't kill me, but just tell me it's wrong. I want to look at two dimensions of inequality, one across and one within trade areas. I prefer trade areas because countries, at the end of the day, they're political units, they may matter or not, but what matters most is where there is free trade within a given area, where there is not, but then the jurisdiction is Italian or French, it doesn't really matter. It matters a bit because the fiscal laws are the same. It's not by chance that we observe a lot of common diseases or common good things across areas and not single countries per se. So inequality across areas is what we call unequal economic development or poverty, relative poverty. Inequality within an area is what we call income inequality. Seems to me, and here I'm going to go very fast because I'm exhausting my time, Globalization has generated a decrease of inequality across trade areas. This is quite evident. I don't have to justify. It has also caused an increase in inequality within certain trade areas, especially those that were already advanced when globalization started. The two phenomena are the result of the same thing. Because technology was embodied and transferable, and because some countries had other inputs that made it possible to transfer it, poor, cheap labor that was nevertheless productive enough to be matched with those technology got matched with those technology. They moved it. One thing that impressed me was a bunch of years ago reading about a whole gigantic steel plant, the largest one that the Krupp Group had in the room, being dismantled, disassembled, packaged, put on ship, and shipped over to China to be reassembled there. I thought, fantastic. This is exactly what I mean, right? It was cheaper to take the plant, disassemble it in Germany, ship it over to China than have to build it on. Tells you something about embodiment. What this is doing, when you look at it in the long run, and I'm not giving a judgment here, I'm just stating a positive fact, it's clearly making a large chunk of the workforce in the advanced countries, what we call the middle and the lower class, economically, and yet, take this term, economically useless, right? Because it lives in a country where the cost of goods and services is what it is. Hence, in order for that workforce to work, it has to receive a certain salary. But that salary induces a cost of the good that makes producing the good there with that specific match completely unmarketable worldwide, given that there is the Chinese, the Indonesian, the Turkish. I'm looking at the data of export from Turkey to Italy, from your governor, I was saying, there you go. Why? Because clearly some of the stuff that on the lower tail of productivity that Italy was producing is easily imitable here. And the workforce here and the unit costs are always enormous. So it's obviously that huge chunk of stuff in Italy is getting displaced by Turkish things. And yet it's not a matter of good or bad. It's not that the Turks don't like the Italians don't like the Turks. That's another matter. We often turn this argument into some nonsense nationalistic. It makes no sense. It's just a plain fact you want to think about. Well, the point of this is, though, that this process just started. When you do an accounting, you realize that there is still maybe between a third and half of Chinese population that is not yet entered in the globalized market of industrial production. That's about half a billion people. And then you got maybe 1 billion in India. And then you got a bunch, you yourself, maybe not by that size, 10th or less than a 10th. And then you got another bunch in Brazil and Latin America. And then you got all of Africa, and you add up, and you got 4 billion people still are open there to be matched. So this is not a process that will be over the day after tomorrow, because it's a process that moves at the speed at which political conditions, end of civil wars or fighting, and ability to accumulate these machines and knowledge that embodies technological advances will make it possible to install nice steel plants in Uganda, just to name one. Okay? So that's, and the other factor, that's the one that concerns more, it has also to do with the possibility of doing that. That is not only the country absorbing the technology, being capable of absorbing it at an economically profitable cost, but the areas from which that technology gets moved, being capable of moving it and not preventing it by setting up monopolistic barriers. In advanced countries, when you look at it, especially in Europe, but not only, if you're following the presidential debate in the United States, you will notice that through the words of the mouth of people, big mouths like Trump and others, this issue is coming out of, let's forget the comic part. Comic part is entertaining, there is a substantive part, which says several things, that even in the most advanced economy, that it's reasonable to see that there is a fraction of the workforce that says, no longer that. I'm done with globalization. I don't want that production process to be moved from Iowa to somewhere in India, because that displaces me. And these people are correctly, I think, perceiving trade as the source of inequality, as the cause of the fact that their real wages have not been growing for 30 years, the fact where the wages of people like me, just to be frank and honest, and other luckier than me, have been growing at a much, much higher real. Okay? So it does become a political issue. Their economic stops. Economics has to stop. It says, look, this is the cause, this is the process, this is what's going on. Now, because the issue is political, because the inequality issue is essentially political, the issue is how do you keep free trade in the sense of usage going on while containing its negative effects on inequality. And that's not an easy task, and my negative view, or at least warning final words, is to reduce inequality within advanced country X, we need to allow more imitation and less intellectual property. That's one thing. As I pointed out, what works well for making Turkey or China or India catching up with the United States, that is allowing or making it possible that entrepreneurs in Turkey, in Iran, in China and India imitate production process in the United States, works also within the United States. Ask yourself, does really Zuckerberg need the hundreds of billions to be motivated to keep going with Facebook? And to the extent that technology under Facebook, I use it because it's provocative, you understand, but it's a good way of understanding it. Why don't we have 200 competing Facebooks, spreading their wealth much more? I mean, all within the United States. I'm not expecting to have people being able to produce technology at the advanced level, say Google is or Facebook or whatever, in countries other than the most advanced one. Yeah, it may happen, but it's chance. Okay? But the question I have to ask is, why was it that in the cotton industry phase, in the car industry phase, even in the PCs phase, I had a lot of people imitating each other and competing. And now I don't have lots of people competing with Facebook and imitating, competing with Apple and the i stuff and imitating. And the answer is, well, because the IP and general creation of monopoly system has become much stronger. So this is something we have to go back and think about. Because within advanced countries, this is one of the major sources of income inequality. The fact that where the big rents have to be made today, we also created a legal and market system that prevents imitation. Without access to imitation possibility, the less lucky have only the imitation might be gained. They cannot imitate, which is what they would spontaneously do. They have to try to catch up with Zuckerberg. Who's Zuckerberg? I don't want. Okay? But this is very hard. First of all, from a social point of view, it's wasteful, but I don't want to get into that. That's another topic. The problem is that it's hardly feasible. Because innovating at the frontier, because of environment, requires an investment in human capital and personal skills that are out of reach for the large share of the population. This is hard to say, but it is. Think about it. Think about it. Working at the frontier today and beating Google at its own game requires a level of skill and human capital and also luck that is hardly the case, especially in front of existing patent laws. And what you do by that is therefore shutting off the natural channel of income redistribution and dissipation of rent. You prevent the Marshallian model, the one I described before, that dissipates rents by redistributing it among imitators from working. They all stay with the first mover. And the first mover can move productive capacity as he sees fit. Apple. I have a huge admiration for Apple and its founders and its guys. But when you think that Apple sits on unspent cash and undistributed cash for profits of close to 180 billion, even 180 billion, okay? No peanuts. That's more than 12% of GDP of Italy. I don't know what it is because I don't know the gross number for the GDP of Turkey, but I'm sure it's a huge chunk, probably 50%, I mean, roughly. What's GDP of Turkey? Half a trillion? But yeah, it's gigantic. So that tells you the amount of rents that are being captured and serves no social purpose and could be eliminated if you could imitate. To put it bluntly, the frontier of technology and innovation has shifted in such a way that even in advanced countries, let alone the non-advanced one, the chance to be an innovator are very slim for most people, very slim. It's very slim to be Michael Jordan. It's very slim the chance of being a superstar movie player. Okay? It's very slim the chance of being a top brain surgeon. So if we think that the solution to the growing economic inequality is that the guys that are being fired or dismissed from, say, car plants have to become surgeons, with dreaming. At best, they can imitate some other technology that becomes available. And this is an investment we can hardly solve. This is an issue that we can hardly solve with more investment in education. One has to be careful. The investment in education thing is certainly a solution and a way to go everywhere, in particularly less advanced economy, but thinking that in countries like the United States or Italy or Germany, we're going to solve the problem of displacement of the half or 2/3 of the workforce that is being displaced by the 5 billion I said before. By sending them more to college, we should think again. And here, let me be even more brutal because I know I'm in front of colleagues. We know perfectly that within each one of our classes, no matter how much effort they put, when it comes to the very advanced and complicated topic, we can put as many hours as we want into the students. When the IQ, the personal capabilities, the skill, the background is what it is, it'll never cross the mark. And there's nothing bad or moral or judgmental about it, it's a matter of fact. This is generating, in my opinion, powerful forces opposing globalization, increasing social tension. So we better face it, and I close here. Global free trade and limitation across countries is not only compatible with monopoly, it's not compatible with monopoly power and prevention of limitation within advanced countries. If we want to look at the roots of global poverty and lack of development on one hand, and income inequality within advanced countries, we're actually looking at the second problem. It is a problem essentially of creating all the legal and institutional conditions that maximize our ability to imitate and adopt. If we only focus on the innovation process, then we're missing most of the picture, and certainly we're missing the part that has to do with reducing wealth inequality and income inequality within countries. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Boldrin. I think we can get a couple questions, very, very short questions, if there are any. No questions?
Went too long.
Okay. Okay. It's almost lunchtime, so let's close up the session. Is there a question?
Just one. You're right that imitation is good. Most of the people grow by imitating, but still the returns to innovation are probably higher than the return to imitation. So if you want to grow fast, probably then you have to go for the innovation path. Is it right?
No, because you're not talking about the same person. I mean, be brutal and stick to the economic thing, even if we're probably useless. Let's pretend we are chemists, biologists, all right? Yes, for the people that are at the frontier, say in the field of biology, it's quite clear that the return to innovation is much higher than the return to imitation. If you're a top guy, say in the medical school where I work, it's one of the top medical schools in the world, you will not get either personal, institutional, or huge gains from imitating the last thing they found at Johns Hopkins, that is a competitor of San Francisco Medical School. Your colleagues will look at you and say, hey, Michele, that's interesting, but you know, John Smith just did it at San Francisco. Anyways. So certainly for those guys, the return to innovation much higher than the return to innovation. But the guys in the medical hospital in Naples, Italy, just take my country, so not to touch personal sensibilities, would probably be very happy to imitate the top guys at worship and just do like that. Their return would be much higher by doing that. Not only, if they try to innovate, they fail because they have no idea what they're doing. You know it perfectly. Take a colleague in our own field that is not aware what the frontier research is, and you tell him prove a new theorem on non-expected utility. The guys look at you and say, huh? Say it again. But if you tell him, hey, catch up with what has been learned on that and teach it to your student and use it in your work, that's something doable. That's in fact one of the major confusion we have. We forget that the subjects to which we are asking the question are heterogeneous.
One more question over there.
Thanks so much. Actually, it's not. It's more of like a contribution to what you just like mentioned, and I'm trying to link all what you try to explain on the innovation, competition, and imitation. I'm trying to look at it from a sustainable development point of view. It's true that innovating is more likely advantageous than just imitating. But I think insofar as economic development, economic growth is concerned, and today we are talking more sustainable development, I want to, it's not like an appeal, to suggest that like imitating for the less developed countries or the middle income countries, imitating will like draw them closer, will like pull them closer to like knowing what happened before. I take example like in the medical field, like when a drug is discovered, maybe in US for example, and we like reproduce the same drug, maybe in India or in China for example. We are not producing the exact drug, but we are like imitating and producing for the mass quantity. But if you want to like follow the original, even the price of the original one cannot be bought in India. Even in China, the price of the original one cannot be bought in India. So I think, from my own point of view, imitating middle income countries, like less developed countries, could help them advance in attaining their economic development as well as their sustainable development goals. So it was just like a point I wanted to raise. Thank you very much.
Perhaps medicine on agriculture. Think of the case of agriculture. We cannot ask farmers in country to innovate on seeds over Monsanto. There is a sandwich company for which lots of my friends at the university work for. You know that very well. They don't like me a lot, but we talk to, so I learn what they do. Over the efficiency of the Iowa guy. The best they can do is to imitate it. If they ever get to the level of efficiency of the Iowa guy or the Monsanto seed producing capability, they'll have achieved economic growth. That's economic growth.
Innovation itself, especially the agricultural domain, also has a negative effect. Like, for example, innovation,
as you rightly said, in the agricultural domain, also have maybe a negative effect because every country like wants to be developed, wants to attain economic growth. And sometimes when I listened to you talk, I was like, well, if everybody goes into innovation, what becomes about the sustainable development goals? Are we going? It has also an effect, like 10th generation agriculture has an effect on the climate, it has an effect on the nature. So when we are talking about innovation, we should not only like deal only on the positive aspect of innovation. Innovation itself, in some sectors, have a contrary effect. I want to be more precise, especially on some sustainable development goals aspects. Thank you very much.
Now it's always like this.
Let's take two more questions.
I have a short question, maybe two short questions. One is, was there really a higher education level, especially in the United States, where there was much technological progress during the, the 90s IT revolution? And was it the reason of the higher growth and technology prevailing during those times? Or were there other factors also affecting this, like maybe institutional ones? I don't know. And the second question is, as a question I raised to the professor, did the imitation in the emerging market economies like China and Brazil or other Southeast Asian and so on, did it bring more innovation from those regions? Does it bring or did it bring? Maybe now there's more innovation from the...
Question on the question. Those regions are those that imitated or those that were being imitated?
No, the ones who imitated the developed countries, did they start to bring more innovation on a global scale? Now, do we get more innovation from those regions as compared to before?
Well, those are difficult questions, so let me give you my take and try not to keep you people from lunch too long. It seems clear that the United States, in fact not only the United States, but most of Northern Europe, Japan and other countries, were the only places on earth where certain kind of innovation could take place in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, for the very simple reason that they had a diffusion of college knowledge and advanced education that nobody had. You understand, there is a sense in which it's a lot of smart people out there, a lot of creative people. But being creative and smart is not enough if you don't know what you're doing. So it's the combination of good, let's call it college education, and its diffusion over a large mass that in some sense increases the probability that you have the big innovation. It's pointless to have super school and super universities that are attended by 5% of the cohort. Because they're 5% of the cohort. If they're attended by 60% of the cohort, then the chances you get the good guy is much higher. It's as simple as that in my opinion. And if you look in particular development of the software industry, as Bill Gates, who was a very honest and smart man, said, man, had we had copyright enforcement and patent enforcement in the software industry 70s and 80s when we started, we would have gone nowhere. Because it was a race among very smart guys, but they were copying each other like there was no tomorrow. And obviously they were copying each other at a very high level, so it was copying and innovating and copying. But as long as they could copy and innovate, they produce a lot of, I don't want to go over this, I mean, in the book, in the stuff that David and others pointed out, most of the stuff we're using was innovated back then. It's being brought to application. And the same is true for your second question. If you look at the process of catching up with those countries in yours, you notice that it's mostly imitation and certainly adaptation, local conditions, work rules, blah, 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 right? Which sometimes produces innovation, but you will scarcely see innovation on the frontier coming out from a country that is developing, unless in that particular area it's caught up. Let me give an example I know well, fashion. Fashion is the most innovative industry, how can I say, by brute force, because people expect a new line every season. Okay, so it's mandatory to innovate. And contrary to the effort of many other lawyers in the United States, particularly, there's a lot of lobbying to patent fashion design. Fashion design is a two-head, right? Well, fashion design at the end requires a certain level of human capital and skill, but it's not as remotely high as nanotechnology. Which is why, say, Italy became late with respect to France. This was eventually caught up pretty quickly and started dominating the field. Which is why now we start seeing a much more widespread market of fashion designers. Suddenly they come in from the United States, the notoriously Americans have no taste. I'm an American citizen, I can confirm that. And they come from Japan, and we see them coming even from here, and we see them coming from a lot of countries. Why? Because it's a kind of industry that requires a background that if you're allowed to imitate, and there you're allowed to imitate, you can catch up pretty quickly. Catching up now technology, it's not happening. That's going to take innovation for a long while. I want us to keep this in mind.
Okay, the final question over there.
Oh, right.
It's a kind of question and it's also a kind of comment. I was really surprised that you have concluded your presentation by indicating the solution was IP and trade.
What's less IP?
Less IP, yes, less IP and more trade. When you started your presentation by mentioning embodiedness knowledge, I expected, especially in the income trap, I expected that you would conclude with the importance of human capital, which is the main determinant of knowledge rather than the others, because imitation requires human capital. So how do you support your conclusion?
Well, I agree with you, but I actually said it. There's absolutely no doubt that it was also in the answer to the colleague that did just before. When you have 60%, 70% attendance rate at college, even if some of those colleges are mediocre, you've built up a societal human capital that is extremely large and diffuse and widespread and maximize the chances that come out the innovator comes out. So there's absolutely no doubt. It's also true that if I build up human capital, what I was trying to, so that's a kind of thing I think that it's well understood, at least within the profession. It may not be well understood by politicians, but here I'm talking to colleagues, okay? So that in order to adopt, imitate, and eventually innovate, you need to invest a lot in the human capital, in the productive human capital, and adapting schools and programs and contents to make people able. I think it was a little embodiment is one reason theoretically it explains. But given that, there are two important caveats. I want to be a bit more provocative and force people to think of what's less obvious. There are two important caveats that I think are very relevant. One is the one about IP. You can build all the human capital you want, but if you're not allowed to imitate the leader, the only thing you can do is to throw away the human capital. Right? Because once you are behind the frontier, even if you have the human capital, if you're not allowed to imitate, you never catch up. If you think you're going to catch up with the frontier, but leapfrogging and innovating over California, dream on. Dream on. That's not the way to go. It's an empirical fact. I'm not making a statement of theory. It's just an empirical fact. So the first thing that is relevant is either we allow that the process of globalization and free trade goes together with the process of imitation of advanced technology, or we are building up a process that is distorted, it's unbalanced, and eventually will kill itself. That's point number one. Point number two, which is referred mostly to advanced countries, is that, and that was the nasty part I gave as an example, asking everybody to think of how hard they worked on their less gifted students, and how there was no hope, no matter how long they worked, they would get the point. We can't make Sergeys out of everybody, I'm sorry. We can't make Ken Arrows out of everybody. It's just a matter of IQ, personal abilities, effort, creativity, and ability to understand the distribution. I know IQ is a very distorted partial measure of our intellectual ability, but it's not so off the mark at the end of the day once you adjust it. And the distribution of IQ is what it is. It has nothing to do with economic development or political regimes. And if to be able to innovate on the frontier, you have to be around 140, I'm sorry, there are a few people around 140. I can send them to school, those around 100, as long as you want. It's a waste of time and money. It's a waste of time and money. That's the part that I put in bold, this is risky. But I am willing to say it's a waste of time and money. Those people can only imitate. And yes, you want to invest in their human capital, but up to a point. After that, you have to allow them to imitate. That way, they will erode some of your rents away, and it's going to be fine. Zuckerberg, in any case, you don't need those things. You know, my joke was, somebody asked, this has to do with copyright, somebody asked Madonna when she was still Maria Ciccone, if she would still have pursued that career, but in a world without copyrights or with very short copyright, so instead of making the hundreds of millions she's made, she would only make 50 millions over her life, what do you think she would have said? No, I'm going to keep cleaning tables on a bar in New Jersey. No, she would have accepted in any case that would allow spreading all those extra rents to a lot of other people, imitators. That's the point.
My second part of my question.
Sorry. How you measure it?
Yeah.
I'll go to the lunch. Let's go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Michele Boldrin for this keynote speech, and to my professor, Altan Güzel, being a moderator. Thank you.